It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And so it was that the quiet village of Longbourn, nestled among the gentle rolling hills of Hertfordshire, found itself one autumn morning buzzing with the sort of whispered excitement that usually accompanied the arrival of a new parish register or the rare appearance of a traveling bookshop. But this morning, the news was far more consequential than either of those modest delights. Mr. Bingley was coming to Netherfield Park, the great house which had stood empty for longer than anyone could quite remember, had at last been let, and not to some doddering elderly gentleman with a cough and a fondness for port, but to a young man of considerable means from the north of England, a young man who, it was rumored, had 4,000 or 5,000 a year. The very number seemed to shimmer in the autumn air as it passed from lip to lip, from cottage to farmhouse, from the butcher's shop to the baker's window, growing slightly larger with each telling, as numbers so often do in small villages where arithmetic is less a science than an art form. Mrs. Bennet, upon hearing the news from her husband, experienced a reaction that could only be described as volcanic. She had been seated in the morning room, her cup of tea growing cold beside her, gazing out at the prospect of another day much like the last, when Mr. Bennet had wandered in with the casual air of a man who had just remembered something mildly interesting, like the name of a particular breed of sheep, or the date of the Battle of Hastings. "My dear," he said, settling into his chair by the fire, "I have just received a letter from Mr. Morris. He informs me that Netherfield Park has been let at last." Mrs. Bennet's response was immediate and physical. She sat bolt upright, her tea sloshing dangerously against the rim of its cup, her eyes widening to a degree that her husband found privately amusing, though though he gave no outward sign of it. Mr. Morris, does he say who has taken it? A young man of large fortune from the north of England. His name is Bingley. 4 or 5,000 a year. Very handsome indeed. There was a pause, during which Mrs. Bennet processed this information with the speed and efficiency of a seasoned general receiving battlefield intelligence. Her mind was already moving pieces across a map, deploying daughters, calculating distances, assessing probabilities. What a fine thing for our girls, she exclaimed, her voice rising to a pitch that caused the cat, which had been sleeping peacefully on the window sill, to open one eye and then close it again in deliberate disinterest. How so? How can it affect them? Mr. Bennet asked, with the innocent tone of a man who knew perfectly well how it could affect them, and was already enjoying the conversation that would follow. My dear Mr. Bennet, replied his wife, with the elaborate patience of someone who has explained something many times before, and yet finds the strength to explain it once more. How can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. Is that his design in settling here? A design? Nonsense. How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. Mr. Bennet regarded his wife with that particular expression he reserved for moments when he found her simultaneously exhausting and entertaining. He had long ago discovered that the best way to manage Mrs. Bennet was not to manage her at all, but to allow her to follow the natural course of her enthusiasms until they exhausted themselves, much like a summer storm passing over the hills. But this time he could not resist a small provocation. I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better. as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party. Mrs. Bennet, who had long since ceased to expect genuine compliments from her husband, and had learned to interpret his words as she wished, took this not as the gentle irony it was, but as something closer to an insult, and she said so at some length and with considerable feeling. Mr. Bennet listened with the appearance of attention, while actually thinking about his book, which he had left upstairs, open and waiting on his bedside table. The truth of the matter, which Mr. Bennet kept to himself with the discipline of a man who had learned that silence was the better part of matrimonial strategy, was that he had every intention of visiting Mr. Bingley, but he had also every intention of not telling Mrs. Bennet so until he had already done it, because he found that the anticipation of things in his wife's case was always more than equal to the things themselves, and he preferred to spare himself the intermediate weeks of planning and speculation that would inevitably accompany any early disclosure. And so the matter stood, at least for the present, while the autumn light slanted golden through the windows of Longbourn, and the leaves on the great oak in the drive turned slowly from green to amber, and the village continued its quiet discussions about the mysterious Mr. Bingley, building him up in imagination into a figure of such perfection and consequence that no actual human being could possibly have survived the comparison. It was in this atmosphere of gentle expectancy that the 5 Bennet daughters moved through their days, each responding to the news in her own characteristic fashion. Jane, the eldest, received the intelligence with her usual serene composure. She was beautiful in a way that was almost discouraging to other young women, not because she was spectacularly so, but because her beauty was of such a quiet and consistent kind that it seemed to require no effort whatsoever. Her complexion was clear, her eyes were bright and kind, and her expression habitually suggested that she found the world a generally pleasing place. She had long ago learned that the best response to her mother's schemes was a gentle smile and a non-committal remark, and she employed this strategy now with her usual grace. Elizabeth, the second daughter, responded rather differently. She was her father's favorite, a fact that was obvious to everyone except Mrs. Bennet, who persisted in considering Elizabeth the least promising of her children on account of her having neither the beauty of Jane nor the good humor of Lydia. Elizabeth was, in fact, quick-witted, lively, and possessed of a figure that was light and pleasing, though she would have been the last to say so. Her face was rendered particularly expressive by a pair of fine dark eyes, which could convey amusement, skepticism, affection, and indignation with equal facility, sometimes all at once. Upon hearing of Mr. Bingley's arrival, Elizabeth observed to her sister that she hoped he would be agreeable, but that she had no intention of joining the general stampede to Netherfield that would undoubtedly follow. Jane, with characteristic kindness, suggested that they ought at least to give the poor man a chance before deciding against him, and Elizabeth agreed that this was only fair, though her tone suggested that she considered the whole business rather more entertaining than consequential. Mary, the third sister, who was neither handsome nor particularly lively, but who had compensated for these deficiencies by developing a stern devotion to improvement and moral instruction, responded to the news by observing that in times of excitement it was especially important to remember the virtues of humility and restraint. No one paid her the slightest attention. Kitty and Lydia, the two youngest, who were scarcely more than girls, and who shared between them a single thought that passed back and forth between them like a shuttle on a loom, reacted with squeals of delight that sent the cat fleeing from the window sill and out into the garden, where it sat beneath a rose bush and groomed itself with an air of wounded dignity. "Officers," Lydia exclaimed, for it had also been mentioned that Mr. Bingley was to bring a party of friends, and where there were young men of fortune, there might also be officers, and where there were officers, Lydia was happiest. Perhaps there will be officers. Oh, I do so hope there will be officers. If there are officers," Kitty added, with the slightly plaintive tone of someone who was always half a step behind her younger sister, "then perhaps we might have a ball." A ball. Lydia seized upon this possibility with the fervor of a naturalist who has just spotted a rare species of butterfly. "Oh, Kitty, a ball at Netherfield. Can you imagine it?" They could imagine it, and they did at great length and with considerable detail, describing the dresses they would wear, the dances they would dance, and the officers who would admire them, until Mrs. Bennet, who had been listening with growing approval, told them to hush, not because they were being unreasonable, but because their father had picked up his newspaper, and she did not wish to irritate him into one of his moods, which tended to make him less cooperative. And so the days passed, each one bringing the village no closer to any actual sighting of Mr. Bingley, but bringing Mrs. Bennet considerably closer to a state of nervous exhaustion. She sent her husband gentle reminders, indirect hints, and outright demands that he visit Netherfield, all of which he received with the same imperturbable good humor, like a man standing in a light rain without an umbrella, and declining to acknowledge that he was getting wet. Then one evening, when Mrs. Bennet had all but abandoned hope, and had begun to direct her strategic energies toward other, more distant prospects, Mr. Bennet announced at dinner that he had called upon Mr. Bingley. The effect was instantaneous. Mrs. Bennet, who had been in the middle of describing the inferiority of the Lucases' new dinner service stopped mid-sentence. The girls looked up from their plates. Even Mary closed her book. "You have seen Mr. Bingley," Mrs. Bennet repeated, as though the words required confirmation. "I have." Mrs. Bennet stared at her husband as though he had just announced that he could fly. "Well done, my dear. I knew you would come round in the end. But tell me everything. What is he like? Is he handsome? Is he agreeable? Did he mention the girls?" Mr. Bennet chewed his meat thoughtfully before replying. "He is quite handsome, quite agreeable, and he did not mention the girls." Mrs. Bennet absorbed this information and immediately began to reinterpret it. The not mentioning of the girls was clearly insignificant, a mere oversight that would be corrected upon further acquaintance. The handsomeness and agreeableness were, of course, exactly what she had hoped for. She pressed her husband for more details, but he had very few to offer, having spent most of his visit in observing Mr. Bingley rather than conversing with him, which was his habit with all new acquaintances. What Mr. Bennet did not mention, because he considered it either too obvious or too uninteresting to warrant remark, was that Mr. Bingley had been accompanied by his sisters, one of whom was married to a Mr. Hurst, and by another gentleman, a tall, handsome figure who had been introduced to him as Mr. Darcy. This omission would prove significant, but Mr. Bennet, in his comfortable way, saw no reason to burden his wife with additional information when she was already so well burdened with her own. In the days that followed, the Bennet household settled into a state of eager anticipation. A ball was indeed to be given at Netherfield, and the news of it spread through the neighborhood with the speed and efficiency of a wildfire in dry grass. Preparations began. Dresses were examined, altered, or despairingly declared inadequate. Ribbons were purchased, repurchased, and purchased again in different colors. Jane and Elizabeth between them managed the family's limited wardrobe with a resourcefulness that would have done credit to a quartermaster in a campaign, while Lydia and Lydia's enthusiasm, which was inexhaustible, kept everyone at a pitch of excitement that made quiet conversation almost impossible. When the evening of the ball at last arrived, it was one of those clear, cold autumn nights when the stars seem to hang lower in the sky than usual, as though they too are curious about what is happening below. The road to Netherfield was lit by the lamps of carriages, and the great house itself blazed with light, every window glowing against the darkness like a promise of pleasure and possibility. The Bennet family arrived in good order. Mrs. Bennet, having spent the entire journey rehearsing instructions to her daughters about how to behave, what to say, and most importantly, how to position themselves so as to maximize their chances of being noticed by Mr. Bingley. These instructions were delivered with the urgency of a military briefing, and received with varying degrees of attention inside the assembly rooms, for the ball was to be held in the grand hall of Netherfield, which had been cleared and prepared for dancing. The scene was one of considerable splendor. Candles flickered in their sconces, casting warm light across the polished floor. The musicians had taken their places in the gallery above and were tuning their instruments with the absorbed concentration of people who knew that their importance would be acknowledged only if something went wrong. The guests moved about in that particular state of controlled chaos that characterizes the opening moments of any large social gathering. Each person simultaneously looking for someone to talk to and trying to appear as though they were perfectly content to be alone. Mr. Bingley himself was impossible to miss. He was tall, handsome, possessed of that rarest of social gifts, a manner that was simultaneously easy and sincere. He moved through the room with an air of genuine delight, greeting everyone he met with a warmth that made each person feel, however briefly, that they were the particular object of his attention. He laughed readily, danced frequently, and showed not the slightest sign of the boredom or superiority that often afflicts young men of fortune when placed in the company of their social inferiors. And he noticed Jane. This was not in itself remarkable. Everyone noticed Jane, but Mr. Bingley noticed her in a particular way, with a degree of attention that went beyond mere aesthetic appreciation and entered the territory of genuine interest. He danced with her not once, but twice, and between the dances stood near her, listening to her quiet, thoughtful conversation with an expression that suggested he found it more engaging than anything else the evening had to offer. Mrs. Bennet, observing this from her position near the punch bowl, experienced a surge of satisfaction so powerful that she was temporarily unable to speak, a condition so unusual that Mr. Bennet glanced at her with mild concern before returning to his own observation of the room, which he found, as he found most social gatherings, moderately amusing and thoroughly exhausting. But if Mr. Bingley was the evening sun, his friend Mr. Darcy was its shadow. He had entered the room with an air of quiet distinction that immediately set him apart from the other guests, not because he was dramatically more handsome or more richly dressed, but because he carried himself with the particular stillness of a man who is aware of his own consequence and sees no reason to advertise it. He was tall and well-formed, with a handsome face that might have been called striking if it had not been arranged in an expression of such studied indifference that it seemed designed to discourage approach and discourage approach it did. Within minutes of his arrival, a consensus had formed among the assembled company that Mr. Darcy was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the room. This consensus was reached with remarkable speed, considering that almost no one had actually spoken to him, but it was reinforced by a piece of intelligence that circulated with the efficiency of a well-managed postal service. Mr. Darcy, it was said, had 10,000 a year. 10,000 a year. The number moved through the room like a current, changing the temperature of every conversation it touched. Had he been poor, his pride would have been merely offensive. But 10,000 a year transformed it into something far more provocative, a challenge, an affront, a slight that every person in the room felt personally entitled to resent. Elizabeth Bennet heard the figure, and the accompanying criticisms from her position near the edge of the dance floor, where she was watching Jane with quiet approval. She observed Mr. Darcy with the same keen attention she brought to all new acquaintances, and what she saw confirmed the general opinion. He stood apart from the other guests, his arms folded, his expression unreadable, watching the dancing with the air of a man who has been dragged somewhere against his will and is determined not to enjoy himself out of pure spite. She noticed, too, that he had not danced. This, in a room where dancing was the primary occupation, and where every man was expected to do his duty, seemed to her a deliberate withdrawal from the social contract, and she filed it away as further evidence of his character. It was not until later in the evening that the incident occurred which was to fix Mr. Darcy's character so firmly in Elizabeth's mind that no subsequent evidence to the contrary would be able for many months to dislodge it. Mr. Bingley, who had been dancing with Jane, came to fetch his friend, whom he found standing in his customary position of aloof observation. "Come, Darcy," he said, with the cheerful insistence of a man who is accustomed to getting his way. "You must dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner. You had much better dance." "I certainly shall not," said Mr. Darcy, with a firmness that suggested the matter had already been thoroughly considered and rejected. "You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as this, it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with. Mr. Bingley, who was not easily discouraged, looked about the room with the air of a man scanning a menu for something his friend might enjoy. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very pretty, and I dare say very agreeable. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you." "Which do you mean?" Mr. Darcy turned and looked with the deliberate appraisal of a man examining a piece of merchandise he has no intention of buying, in the direction of Elizabeth, who happened to be sitting directly behind him. He looked at her for a moment. Elizabeth, who had not heard the beginning of the conversation, but who could see from Mr. Bingley's animated gestures and Mr. Darcy's resistant posture that she was being discussed, met his gaze with a steady look of her own. "She is tolerable," said Mr. Darcy, turning back to his friend, "but not handsome enough to tempt me. I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Mr. Bingley laughed, but he did not press the matter further, and he returned to Jane, leaving Mr. Darcy to his solitude. Elizabeth, who had heard every word, felt a surge of indignation that was tempered almost immediately by amusement. She was not a woman who wasted emotion on the opinions of people she did not respect, and she had already formed a sufficiently low opinion of Mr. Darcy to make his criticism of her appearance seem more absurd than painful. She told the story with considerable embellishment and a great deal of humor to her friends, and it circulated through the room, adding yet another layer to the general conviction that Mr. Darcy was, beyond all possibility of redemption, the most insufferable man in Hertfordshire. The evening wore on. Jane danced and smiled and was happy. Lydia danced with every officer who would have her, and was noisier still. Kitty followed Lydia and was marginally quieter. Mary played a concerto at the piano with the grim determination of a prisoner performing for her captors, and was received with the polite indifference that usually attended her musical efforts. Mr. Bennet observed everything and said nothing. Mrs. Bennet calculated and schemed, and went home in a state of high satisfaction that was only slightly diminished by her husband's refusal to convey his carriage to the door, on the grounds that he preferred to walk, and that the exercise would do her good. In the days that followed the ball, the neighborhood continued to discuss Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy with the sustained energy that only small communities can bring to the analysis of new arrivals. Mr. Bingley was universally approved of. He was friendly, open, and unpretentious. He called upon Mr. Bennet and was received with civility. He expressed admiration for Jane, which was noted and celebrated. He showed every sign of being precisely the sort of young man that the neighborhood had hoped for: rich, agreeable, and apparently willing to be pleased. Mr. Darcy, by contrast, became the subject of a sustained and increasingly creative campaign of criticism. His pride was discussed from every possible angle, as though it were a geological formation that required thorough mapping. His income was mentioned frequently, always in tones that suggested it ought to have produced a better manner. His refusal to dance was recounted so many times, and in so many different versions, that the original event had become almost unrecognizable, like a pebble that has been worn smooth by a river. Elizabeth, for her part, found Mr. Darcy a reliable source of amusement. She enjoyed dissecting his character with her friends, pointing out each new instance of pride or rudeness with the practiced eye of a naturalist cataloging specimens. She did not hate him. Hatred required a degree of emotional investment that she was not prepared to make, but she disliked him thoroughly, and she found in this dislike a steady supply of conversational material that enlivened many an otherwise dull evening. It was at about this time that a new figure entered the neighborhood in the person of Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins was the rector of a parish in Kent, and he was also, by virtue of a complicated entailment that Mr. Bennet took perverse pleasure in never fully explaining, the person who would inherit Longbourn upon Mr. Bennet's death. This meant that upon Mr. Bennet's demise, Mrs. Bennet and her 5 daughters would be turned out of their home with nothing but their personal possessions, and whatever small sum Mr. Bennet had been able to set aside, which was not considerable, Mr. Collins wrote to Mr. Bennet to announce his intention of visiting, and his letter was a masterpiece of a particular kind of prose that Elizabeth found both fascinating and repellent. It was pompous, obsequious, self-important, and utterly devoid of self-awareness, a combination that she had not previously thought possible in a single document. Mr. Collins announced that he intended to make amends for the injustice of the entailment by marrying one of Mr. Bennet's daughters, a proposal that he seemed to consider not only generous, but positively noble. as though he were conferring a favor rather than extracting a compensation. When Mr. Collins arrived, he proved to be exactly what his letter had promised. A tall, heavy-looking young man of 25, with a grave and pompous air that was entirely at odds with his actual consequence, which was negligible. He was the protégé of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, a wealthy and aristocratic widow who dominated his imagination to such an extent that he could scarcely complete a sentence without mentioning her name, her estate, her daughter, or her carriage. His conversation was an unending monologue about Lady Catherine's greatness, interrupted only by his own observations about the size and elegance of the rooms he found himself in, which he always pronounced to be very fine, though never quite so fine as those at Rosings. Mrs. Bennet received Mr. Collins with a degree of cordiality that was directly proportional to her understanding that he might marry one of her daughters and thus solve the entailment problem. Which daughter she did not particularly care, though she had already begun to form opinions on the subject that she would share with anyone who would listen, and several people who would not. Mr. Collins, for his part, surveyed the 5 Bennet sisters with the appraising eye of a man selecting livestock at a fair. He initially inclined toward Jane, but Mrs. Bennet, with the shrewdness that occasionally surfaced from beneath her general frivolity, like a fish rising in a pond, informed him that Jane was likely soon to be engaged. Mr. Collins then transferred his attentions to Elizabeth, who received them with the kind of polite resistance that only made him more determined, like a man trying to open a door that has been locked against him. The matter came to a head one evening when Mr. Collins, having determined that Elizabeth was the object of his affections, waylaid her in the morning room and delivered a proposal of marriage that was so spectacularly bad, so so comprehensive in its inadequacy that Elizabeth found herself almost unable to believe that it was genuinely happening. He began by explaining that he had chosen a wife for 3 reasons. First, because he thought it was the right thing to do as a clergyman. Second, because Lady Catherine had advised it. And third, because he was convinced that he would make Elizabeth happy. He then proceeded to detail his financial situation, his connection to Lady Catherine, and his expectations for the marriage, all with the serene confidence of a man who cannot conceive of being refused. Elizabeth, who had been listening with a mixture of astonishment and disbelief, interrupted him as soon as she could do so, with anything approaching politeness. "I am not one of those young ladies," she said, with a composure that was remarkable given the circumstances, "who are so daring as to risk their happiness on the chance of being asked a second time. I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who could make you happy." Mr. Collins stared at her with the blank expression of a man who has just been told that the earth is flat and is trying to compute the implications. He had not, it was clear, prepared for refusal. His entire mental architecture, built as it was around the certainty of his own desirability and the rightness of Lady Catherine's advice, had no room for the possibility that a woman in Elizabeth's position, a woman with no fortune and no prospects, would decline an offer that he considered so manifestly advantageous. He told her so at some length and with considerable repetition. Elizabeth, whose patience was considerable but not infinite, repeated her refusal with equal firmness and rather more brevity. Mr. Collins, who had by now entered a state of confusion that rendered him incapable of original thought, fell back upon the only strategy available to him. He assumed that she was merely being coy, that her refusal was a form of encouragement, and that persistence would eventually be rewarded. It was at this point that Mrs. Bennet intervened with all the subtlety of a battering ram. She entered the room, discovered the situation, and immediately took Mr. Collins's side with an enthusiasm that bordered on the physical. She exhorted Elizabeth to accept. She described the horrors of being turned out of Longbourn. She wept. She scolded. She invoked the memory of Elizabeth's poor father, who would be so distressed. She did everything except listen to her daughter, which was the one thing that might actually have helped. Mr. Bennet, when informed of the situation, took a different approach. He called Elizabeth to his library, listened to her account with his customary air of mild amusement, and then delivered a judgment that was characteristic in its brevity and its absolute clarity. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, he said, and I will never see you again if you do. Elizabeth smiled. She had expected no less from her father, whose support, though expressed in the most economical possible terms, was worth more to her than all of her mother's entreaties combined. Mr. Collins, having been definitively refused, retreated into a state of wounded dignity that expressed itself in long silences, heavy sighs, and the composition of a letter to Lady Catherine, in which he presumably explained the inexplicable. He did not, however, leave Longbourn, because he had not yet completed his planned visit, and Mr. Collins was a man who always completed his plans, regardless of whether the circumstances that had given rise to them still obtained. It was in the aftermath of this episode that an event occurred which was to have a profound and lasting effect on Elizabeth's understanding of Mr. Darcy, though she did not know it at the time. Mr. Wickham arrived. He came to Meryton in the company of a regiment of soldiers who were to be stationed in the town for the winter. he made an immediate and favorable impression. He was handsome in a way that was entirely different from Mr. Darcy's softer, more open, more accessible. He had a ready smile, an easy manner, and a gift for conversation that made him instantly popular. He was, moreover, an officer, which in Lydia's eyes rendered him virtually divine, and in Kitty's eyes made him a close second. Elizabeth met Mr. Wickham quite by chance in the street outside the butcher's shop, where she had gone to order a joint for Sunday dinner. He introduced himself with a charming awkwardness that she found engaging, and they fell into conversation with the ease of two people who discover that they have an unexpected amount in common. It was in this conversation, and in several that followed over the next few days, that Mr. Wickham revealed the history of his connection with Mr. Darcy. He spoke of it with a reluctance that was itself persuasive. A man who is reluctant to speak ill of another, Elizabeth felt, is more likely to be telling the truth than one who speaks freely. And what he told her was damning. Mr. Darcy's father, it seemed, had been the patron of Mr. Wickham's father, who had been the steward at Pemberley. The great Darcy estate in Derbyshire. The elder Darcy had provided for Mr. Wickham's education and had intended to provide him with a living in the church. But upon the elder Darcy's death, the younger Darcy had deliberately withheld the living, despite the clear intentions of his father, and had left Mr. Wickham to make his way in the world without the provision that had been promised to him. The story had everything that Elizabeth's imagination required. A villain in the person of Mr. Darcy, whose pride and cruelty were now confirmed by independent testimony. A victim in the person of Mr. Wickham, whose gentle manners and evident suffering made him an object of natural sympathy, and a moral that was as satisfying as it was simple. consequence or no guarantee of goodness, and that the surface of a person could conceal depths of villainy that only the discerning eye could detect. Elizabeth, who had already decided that she disliked Mr. Darcy, found in Mr. Wickham's story not new information, but confirmation of what she had already believed. This, she did not realize, was precisely the danger, that she was hearing the story not as evidence to be weighed, but as a gift to be unwrapped, something that fit so neatly into the box she had already prepared for it, that she never stopped to wonder whether the box itself was the right shape. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth's dislike of Mr. Darcy hardened into something more durable than mere first impression. She observed him at every opportunity, and every observation seemed to confirm what she already knew. He was proud. She saw it in the way he held himself apart from company, in the way he spoke to those he considered beneath him, in the way he looked at people as though measuring them against some standard that only he could see. He was unkind. She saw it in his treatment of Mr. Wickham, who visibly stiffened whenever Darcy entered the room, and in his coldness toward anyone who did not meet his exacting requirements. He was unreasonable. She saw it in his determination to separate his friend Bingley from Jane, a scheme that she detected, or believed she detected, in the sudden cooling of Bingley's attentions and his eventual departure from Netherfield without so much as a farewell to Jane. This last development was the most painful. Jane, who had received Mr. Bingley's attentions with a quiet pleasure that she had taken care not to exaggerate, was left in a state of gentle bewilderment that was, in its way, more distressing than any display of grief would have been. She did not weep or complain. She simply continued with her life as though nothing had changed. But Elizabeth, who knew her sister's heart, could see the absence in her eyes, the slight hesitation before she spoke of Netherfield, the way she sometimes stood at the window and looked toward the park as though expecting something that she knew would not come. Elizabeth was furious. She attributed the entire business to Mr. Darcy, who she was certain had engineered Bingley's departure in order to prevent a marriage that he considered beneath his friend. That Jane was the most beautiful and the most amiable woman in the neighborhood counted for nothing against the fact that she had no fortune, no connections, and a mother whose behavior in company was sufficient to disgrace any family. Mr. Darcy, with his pride and his class consciousness and his 10,000 a year, had decided that Jane Bennet was not good enough for Charles Bingley, and he had acted on that decision with the cold efficiency of a man who is accustomed to having his wishes obeyed. Elizabeth's anger was not the loud, theatrical kind that exhausts itself in a single outburst. It was the quieter, more persistent variety, the kind that settles into the bones and colors every subsequent thought. She did not speak of it constantly. She was too proud for that. But it was always there, a steady background hum of resentment that influenced her interpretation of everything Mr. Darcy said and did. It was in this state of mind that Elizabeth set out for Kent in the spring to visit her friend Charlotte Lucas, who had recently married Mr. Collins and taken up residence at the parsonage near Rosings Park, Lady Catherine de Bourgh's great estate. The journey was long and the weather indifferent, but Elizabeth's spirits were good, for she was fond of Charlotte and curious to see how her friend managed the formidable challenge of being married to Mr. Collins. She found the parsonage small but comfortable, and Charlotte's management of it admirable. Mr. Collins was exactly as he had been at Longbourn, except that he was now able to conduct his adoration of Lady Catherine from a position of geographical proximity that gave it a new intensity. He spoke of Lady Catherine as other men speak of God, with reverence, awe, and a terror of displeasing her that bordered on the religious. He described her house, her gardens, her furniture, her carriage, her daughter, and her dogs with a particularity of detail that would have been exhausting, even if the subject had been inherently interesting, which it was not. Lady Catherine herself, Elizabeth met for the first time at Rosings, and she found her precisely what she had expected. A tall, large woman with strongly marked features and an air of authority that derived not from any particular quality of mind or character, but from the simple fact of having been rich and aristocratic for so long that she had forgotten there was any other way to be. Lady Catherine asked questions with the directness of a customs official and expected answers with the promptness of a servant. She expressed opinions as though they were decrees, and she received disagreements as though they were acts of treason. Elizabeth, who was not easily intimidated, held her own in these exchanges with a quiet firmness that surprised Lady Catherine, irritated Mr. Collins, and amused Colonel Fitzwilliam, Mr. Darcy's cousin, who happened to be visiting Rosings at the same time. For Mr. Darcy was also at Rosings. Elizabeth learned of his presence with a sinking feeling that she took care to conceal beneath an expression of polite indifference. She had hoped, without admitting it to herself, that she had seen the last of Mr. Darcy when he left Hertfordshire with Bingley. His reappearance in her life, in the very parish where she was visiting, felt like a deliberate provocation, though she could not have said by whom. Their encounters at Rosings were frequent, because Mr. Darcy was a regular visitor at the parsonage, and because Lady Catherine, who took a possessive interest in everything that happened within her sphere of influence, seemed to derive some satisfaction from bringing them together, perhaps in the belief that her own consequence was such no one could fail to be impressed in her presence. Elizabeth found that Mr. Darcy's behavior toward her had changed, though she could not quite determine the nature of the change. He was not precisely friendly. That word was too weak to describe the intensity that he brought to their conversations, but he was attentive. He sought her out. He asked her questions that went beyond the merely polite. He listened to her answers with a concentration that she found both flattering and unsettling. He seemed at times to be struggling with something internal, some impulse that he was alternately embracing and restraining, like a man who has decided to climb a wall and keeps reaching for the top and then pulling back. Elizabeth, who was not unintuitive where the feelings of others were concerned, noticed this behavior, but misinterpreted it entirely. She attributed it to the same pride and condescension that she had always seen in him. He was, she supposed, amused by her, in the way that a rich man might be amused by a clever pet. He found her different from the other women of his acquaintance, and this difference entertained him. But it did not, she was certain, imply any deeper regard. She was wrong. The truth was that Mr. Darcy was in the grip of an emotion that he had not experienced before, and that he did not entirely understand. He had come to Rosings expecting to pass a dull few weeks in the company of his aunt and his cousin, and instead he had found Elizabeth Bennet, with her fine eyes and her quick wit and her absolute refusal to be impressed by anything that he or Lady Catherine or anyone else could offer. She challenged him. She contradicted him. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts amusement and defiance, as though she could see through the armor of his reserve, and found what lay beneath it not intimidating, but merely ridiculous. He was, for the first time in his life, not in control of a social situation, and the experience was simultaneously agonizing and exhilarating. He found himself thinking about her at odd moments, during dinner, during his aunt's interminable monologues, during his walks in the park. He found himself rehearsing things he might say to her, then discarding them as either too forward or too guarded. He found himself looking for her in a room before he had even registered that he was looking, and then being annoyed with himself for looking. He was falling in love with her, and he did not know how to stop. The crisis came on an evening in April, when Elizabeth was sitting alone at the parsonage, having just recovered from a cold that had kept her indoors for several days. She was reading a letter from Jane, in which Jane described, with her usual gentle reticence, the pain of Bingley's absence and her own effort to accept it with equanimity. Elizabeth was feeling sad and reflective, and was not prepared for the interruption that came. Mr. Darcy entered the room. He was alone, which was unusual. He walked in with a purposefulness that Elizabeth had not seen in him before, and she looked up from her letter with an expression of surprise that quickly gave way to wariness. He began to pace. He seemed agitated, restless, unable to settle into any one position or to meet her eyes directly. Elizabeth watched him, her wariness growing, and waited. When he spoke, his voice was uneven, as though each word required a separate effort of will. "In vain I have struggled," he said. "It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." Elizabeth stared at him. For a moment, a long, disorienting moment, she was unable to process what he had said. The words were familiar individually, but arranged in a combination that made no sense in the context of her understanding of their relationship. Mr. Darcy, who had called her tolerable, who had insulted her at the Meryton Assembly, who had separated Bingley from Jane, who had ruined Mr. Wickham's life. This Mr. Darcy was telling her that he loved her. The moment passed, in its place came a rush of anger so powerful that it surprised even her. She could speak. She found that she could speak very well indeed. She told him, in terms that were measured only in the sense that a surgeon's knife is measured, precise, deliberate, and designed to cut, that he had no reason to expect that his proposal would be welcome. She told him that he had violated every principle of propriety by expressing a sentiment that could only give pain. She told him that he was the last man in the world whom she could ever be prevailed upon to marry. Mr. Darcy, who had been standing with the rigid stillness of a man receiving a physical blow, recoiled. His complexion changed. The composure that he wore like a second skin cracked, and beneath it, Elizabeth saw something raw and exposed astonishment, hurt, and a kind of dawning horror at what he had set in motion. She was not finished. The anger that had been building for months, fed by every slight and every imagined injustice, poured out of her now with a force that was beyond her control. She accused him of ruining Jane's happiness by separating her from Bingley. She accused him of destroying Mr. Wickham's prospects out of mere spite and jealousy. She accused him of arrogance, cruelty, and selfishness, and she did so with a fluency and a precision that left no room for ambiguity. Mr. Darcy listened. He did not interrupt, did not defend himself, did not attempt to explain or mitigate. He stood and he listened, and his expression shifted from shock to something more complex. A dawning recognition, perhaps, of the full extent of what he had done, and of how he had appeared through her eyes. When she had finished, there was a silence that seemed to fill the room like water, pressing against the walls and the furniture and the two people who stood in it, unable to touch each other across the distance that had opened between them. Mr. Darcy spoke at last, and his voice was different now, quieter, stripped of its usual authority, carrying in it something that Elizabeth had never heard before, and did not immediately recognize as humility. "I have no right to complain," he said. "I might, perhaps, wish to be informed why, with so little endeavor at civility, I am thus rejected. But it is of no consequence. I shall never recur to the subject." He paused, and then added, with an effort that was visible in the tension of his jaw and the whiteness of his knuckles, "These accusations would have had no force had I been truly the person you describe. But I am not without fault, and I see that I have given you just cause for your opinions." He turned to leave, and then stopped, as though some final impulse had seized him. He asked, with a calm that seemed to cost him everything, whether her accusations were the only reasons for her refusal. Elizabeth, who was still trembling with the aftermath of her own anger, told him that they were. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a softness that was more affecting than any slam would have been, and Elizabeth was alone. She sat in the silence that followed and felt, with a slow, sinking certainty that something had happened that could not be undone. She was still angry. The anger was still there, warm and bright and sustaining. But beneath it, like a current beneath the surface of a river, there was something else. A doubt, a small, insistent voice that asked whether she had been entirely just, whether she had heard the whole story, whether the picture she had constructed of Mr. Darcy was as complete and as accurate as she had always believed. She pushed the voice away. She had no use for it. She had been right. She was sure she had been right. And no amount O.F. Chinese letter unease could change the facts as she understood them. But the voice did not go away. It stayed with her through the night, whispering its quiet questions into the dark, and it was still there in the morning, when she woke to find a letter waiting for her, delivered by a servant, addressed in a hand that she recognized immediately as Mr. Darcy's. She opened it with fingers that were not quite steady, and she read it. The letter was long, and it changed everything. He began by acknowledging the justice of her displeasure and the offense that he had given. He did not apologize for his feelings. He was too proud for that, even now. But he accepted that the manner of expressing them had been unforgivable. Then he addressed her accusations, one by one, with a thoroughness and a candor that left no room for evasion. First, the matter of Jane and Bingley. He admitted that he had separated them, but not from the motives she had attributed to him. He had observed Jane's behavior and had concluded, rightly or wrongly, that her affection for Bingley was warm but not deep, that she was not in love with him in the way that Bingley was in love with her. He had also been influenced by the behavior of Jane's mother and younger sisters, which he described with a frankness that was painful to read, but impossible to dismiss. He acknowledged that in separating them, he may have been wrong, but he insisted that his motives had been sincere. He had believed that he was protecting his friend from an imprudent marriage. Then the matter of Mr. Wickham. What Mr. Darcy wrote about Wickham was so different from what Elizabeth had believed that she read it twice, and then a third time, before the full implications began to settle in her mind. Wickham, far from being the victim of Darcy's cruelty, was a man of fundamentally dishonest character. The living that Wickham claimed had been promised to him had indeed been left to his discretion, but Wickham had voluntarily relinquished all claim to it in exchange for a sum of money, which he had immediately spent. He had then returned when the money was gone and demanded the living, which Darcy had refused. Since then, Wickham had pursued a course of behavior that included an attempt to elope with Darcy's younger sister Georgiana, who was then only 15, an attempt motivated entirely by the desire to gain access to her fortune of £30,000. The plot had been discovered in time, but Georgiana had been deeply affected, and Darcy had kept the matter quiet to protect his sister's reputation. Elizabeth read this, and the world shifted beneath her feet. She thought of her own behavior, her ready acceptance of Wickham's story, her eager condemnation of Darcy, her absolute certainty that she understood the situation. She saw, with a clarity that was almost physical, how completely she had been deceived. She had believed Wickham because he was charming and agreeable, and because his story confirmed what she already wanted to believe. She had disbelieved Darcy because he was proud and reserved, and because his behavior offended her pride. The letter did not excuse Darcy's pride, his manners, or the injury he had done to Jane, but it destroyed, utterly and irrevocably, the foundation upon which she had built her hatred of him. And without that foundation, the whole edifice of her certainty collapsed, and she was left standing in the rubble, looking at the ruins of her own judgment, and seeing for the first time how thoroughly she had been the architect of her own misunderstanding. She wept, not for Darcy and not for Wickham, but for herself, for the person she had thought she was, the person who saw clearly and judged wisely, and was immune to the errors that afflicted lesser minds. She had been no wiser than anyone else. She had been, if anything, more foolish, because she had been so confident in her own wisdom. The days that followed were among the most difficult of Elizabeth's life. She remained at the parsonage, seeing Mr. Darcy only in company, where he maintained a polite distance that was more painful to her than any hostility would have been. She was civil to him. She could be nothing else. But the civility was strained on her side, and she knew that he perceived the strain, though he was too gentlemanly to remark upon it. She went home to Longbourn with a heart that was heavier than she could easily conceal. Jane, perceptive as always, noticed her sister's altered spirits and asked, with gentle concern, what was the matter. Elizabeth, who had never kept a secret from Jane in her life, came close to telling her everything: the proposal, the letter, the revolution in her understanding. But something held her back. She was not yet ready to speak of it. The wound was too fresh, and the shame of her own error was too raw. She told Jane only that she was tired, and Jane, who never pressed where gentle silence would do, accepted this and held her sister's hand. The summer passed. Lydia went to Brighton with the regiment, and Elizabeth, who had foreseen nothing but trouble from this expedition, was unable to prevent it. Jane went to London and returned no less serene, though Elizabeth suspected that the serenity was hard-won. Mr. Bennet retreated to his library. Mrs. Bennet bustled and complained and planned dinners that no one wanted to attend. Mary read improving books and offered observations that no one wanted to hear. Kitty moped in Lydia's absence, like a dog whose favorite companion has been taken for a walk without her. And then, in the midst of this quiet, unremarkable summer, the letter arrived from Mr. Gardiner that brought everything crashing down. Lydia had eloped with Wickham. The words, when Elizabeth read them, seemed to detach themselves from the page and float in the air before her, separate from meaning, like objects in a dream. Lydia, her youngest sister, the girl who had never taken anything seriously, who had laughed and flirted and danced through life as though consequences were something that happened to other people, had run away with George Wickham, a man with no fortune, no principle, and no intention of marrying her. The implications were catastrophic. An elopement without marriage meant ruin not just for Lydia, but for the entire family. No respectable man would marry into a family that had been touched by such scandal. Jane's prospects, which had been so bright, were extinguished. Elizabeth's own hopes, whatever they might have been, were gone. Mary and Kitty would be lucky to find anyone at all, and Mr. Bennet, who had failed to restrain his youngest daughter when restraint might have saved them all, would carry the weight of his failure for the rest of his life. Elizabeth told no one. She sat with the letter in her hand and felt the future collapse around her like a building in an earthquake. And she thought of Mr. Darcy's letter and of his description of Wickham's attempt on Georgiana, and she understood with a terrible clarity that the man she had defended and befriended and believed was capable of anything, and that she had, in her blind prejudice, handed him access to her family. She went to find her father. She found him in his library, as she had expected, and she showed him the letter. Mr. Bennet read it, and for the first time in Elizabeth's memory, the mask of ironic detachment slipped from his face, and she saw beneath it something that she had never seen before: genuine distress. Not the theatrical distress of her mother, which was loud and performative and ultimately self-serving, but a quiet, private anguish that was all the more painful for being so contained. Mr. Bennet set off for London in pursuit of the fugitives, and Elizabeth waited at Longbourn in a state of anxiety that ate through her days like acid through cloth. She could not eat. She could not sleep. She sat in the morning room and stared at the window and listened to her mother's hysterical lamentations, which filled the house like the sound of a wounded animal, and she felt herself sinking into a darkness that seemed to have no bottom. It was during this darkest period that an event occurred that Elizabeth would later look back on as the moment when the course of her life changed irrevocably. Though at the time she was too consumed by worry to recognize its significance. Mr. Darcy came to Longbourn. He came quietly, without announcement, and he found Elizabeth alone in the sitting room, her face drawn and pale, her eyes red from weeping that she had not allowed anyone to see. He looked at her, and she saw in his face an expression that she had never seen there before, not pride, not reserve, not the cold authority that she had once mistaken for cruelty, but a deep and genuine concern that was almost painful in its intensity. He did not stay long. He asked after her health, made some polite inquiry about her family, and then left. But before he went, he said something that struck her, even in her distracted state, as significant. "I hope you will not think of writing to your uncle," he said, referring to Mr. Gardiner, who was in London assisting in the search for Lydia. "I have some acquaintance with the circumstances, and I believe I may be of some service." Elizabeth, who was too bewildered to fully comprehend what he meant, could only murmur her thanks. He bowed and left, and she was alone again, wondering what he had meant and why he had come. The answer came days later, in a letter from Mr. Gardiner, and it was an answer that shook Elizabeth to the core of her being. Lydia was found. She was to be married to Wickham, and the marriage had been arranged, the expenses paid, the debts settled, the commission purchased by Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy, the man she had rejected, the man she had insulted, the man whose proposal she had thrown back in his face with a contempt that she now, in retrospect, found physically painful to recall. He had gone to London, had tracked down Wickham, a man he despised, and who despised him, had negotiated with him, had paid him, had arranged everything, and had done it all without expectation of credit or recognition. He had asked only that his involvement be kept secret. Elizabeth sat with this knowledge and felt something break open inside her, something that she had been holding closed for months, something that she had not even known was there. She saw Mr. Darcy clearly now, for the first time, without the filter of her prejudice and her pride. She saw a man who who was imperfect, proud, reserved, socially awkward, capable of errors of judgment that had caused real harm, but who was also capable of a generosity and a selflessness that went far beyond anything she had ever expected of him. She saw a man who had loved her quietly and without hope, and who had demonstrated that love not in words, but in actions, in the most difficult and costly actions that a man in his position could undertake. She wept, and this time the tears were not for herself, but for him, for the pain that she had caused him, and for the love that she had not recognized until it was almost too late. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet transformation. Lydia returned to Longbourn as a married woman, noisy and self-satisfied, and utterly oblivious to the disaster she had so narrowly averted. She chattered about Wickham with the same breathless enthusiasm she had brought to everything else in her life, and she showed no sign of understanding the gravity of what she had done, or of the sacrifice that had been made to rescue her. Elizabeth listened to her sister's prattle with a new and painful awareness. She saw with a clarity that her previous blindness made all the more acute, the vast gulf between Lydia's trivial selfishness and Mr. Darcy's profound generosity, and she understood that it was in this gulf that the true measure of character was to be found, not in the surface qualities that society valued, the charm and the ease and the ready smile, but in the deeper capacities for sacrifice and for love that revealed themselves only in moments of genuine trial. Mr. Darcy returned to Netherfield with Mr. Bingley. This, in itself, was significant. Bingley, it seemed, had been told the truth about Jane's feelings, or rather, he had been allowed to discover it for himself under circumstances that Mr. Darcy had carefully arranged, and he had come back to Hertfordshire with the single-minded determination of a man who has wasted enough time and intends to waste no more. He proposed to Jane, Jane accepted with a quiet happiness that was all the more beautiful for its restraint. Mrs. Bennet, whose emotions had been on a pendulum swing between despair and euphoria for weeks, settled into a state of near continuous rapture that would have been exhausting to witness if it had not been so genuinely felt. Mr. Bennet observed the engagement with his customary irony, and privately admitted to Elizabeth that he thought Bingley a very good sort of fellow, which, from Mr. Bennet, was the highest possible praise. But it was Mr. Darcy's presence that occupied Elizabeth's thoughts. She saw him frequently in company with Bingley and Jane, and she was acutely aware of him in a way that she had never been before, aware of his movements, his expressions, the tone of his voice. She watched him and wondered, with a mixture of hope and fear that she could not entirely control, whether what she felt for him now was something different from what she had felt before. It was. What she had felt before was dislike, sharp and satisfying and self-righteous. What she felt now was something far more unsettling, a recognition, slow and reluctant and irresistible, that this man, this proud, difficult, extraordinary man, was the person she wanted, not the person she ought to want, or the person who would be most advantageous to want, but the person who, in some deep and essential part of herself, she already belonged to. The moment of recognition, when it came, was quiet and unremarkable in its circumstances. They were walking together in the grounds near Longbourn, having been thrown into each other's company by the simple accident of being the only two people who had not gone into the house when the rain began. They walked in silence for a time, and then Mr. Darcy spoke. "Elizabeth," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice, the way he said it, as though it were something precious and fragile and almost too dangerous to hold, made her stop walking and turn to face him. He was looking at her with an expression that she had seen once before on the evening of his first proposal. But it was different now. Then it had been strained, almost desperate, the expression of a man forcing himself to speak against his own better judgment. Now it was open, unguarded, and in it she could see everything that he felt, the love that had survived her rejection, the hope that had persisted through months of silence, the fear that she might refuse him again. "You are too generous to trifle with me," he said. "If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever." Elizabeth looked at him. The rain was falling softly around them, darkening the stone of the path and the bark of the trees and the fabric of their clothes. And the world had shrunk to the small space between them, a space that was charged with everything that had passed between them. The misunderstanding and the cruelty and the shame and the slow, painful journey toward understanding that they had each undertaken separately and together. She found that she could speak, but that the words she had prepared, the careful explanations and qualifications that she had rehearsed in her mind, would not come. What came instead was simpler and truer. "My feelings," she said, "are so far from what they were last April that I now realize that I was entirely wrong in my judgment of you. I was blind, prejudiced, and absurd. What I feel now is gratitude and admiration." And she paused, and the pause was the longest moment of her life. "And love, I love you." The rain continued to fall. Mr. Darcy took her hand, and the touch of his fingers against hers was warm and sure and steady, and she knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason and beyond doubt, that she was home. They walked back to the house in a state of quiet happiness that needed no words to sustain it. The rain eased, and the clouds parted, and a pale light spread across the fields, and the world, which had seemed so dark and so full of danger, was luminous and new. Mrs. Bennet, when she learned of the engagement, experienced a reaction that was even more volcanic than her reaction to the news of Mr. Bingley's arrival. She went from disbelief to astonishment to joy in the space of 30 seconds, and she expressed each stage with a volume and intensity that caused the cat, which had been sleeping on the kitchen table, to flee the house entirely and take refuge in the garden, where it remained for the rest of the day. Mr. Bennet, when Elizabeth went to him with her news, looked at her for a long time with an expression that was unreadable even to her, and then said, with the dry precision that was his particular gift, "So you have overcome your prejudice against him, and he has overcome his pride. I congratulate you both. I dare say you will be very happy, though I cannot imagine why." But there was a warmth beneath the irony, and Elizabeth, who knew her father better than anyone, heard it and was content. In the autumn of that year, 2 weddings took place at Longbourn. Jane married Mr. Bingley in a ceremony that was attended by half the county, and celebrated with a generosity that reflected Bingley's natural openness of heart. Elizabeth married Mr. Darcy in a quieter ceremony, attended by family and close friends, and celebrated with a happiness that was, if possible, even deeper for being less conspicuous. The years that followed were good years. Jane and Bingley settled near Longbourn, in a house that was comfortable without being grand, and their happiness was of the steady, unvarying kind that draws no attention to itself, but is, for that very reason, all the more enduring. Elizabeth and Darcy lived at Pemberley, the great estate in Derbyshire, and there Elizabeth learned, in the daily rhythm of domestic life, the full extent of the man she had married. She learned that his pride was real, but that it was not the cold, contemptuous thing she had once believed it to be. It was kind of shyness, a difficulty in expressing himself to those he did not know well, a reserve that fell away like a coat being unbuttoned in the presence of those he loved. With her, he was open, warm, even playful. He teased her about her family, and she teased him about his. And between them there grew a private language of jokes and references, and shared glances that made their company, even after years of marriage, a source of constant delight. She learned that his generosity was not exceptional, but habitual. He did good not for the sake of being seen to do good, but because it was, quite simply, what he did. He supported his sister Georgiana with a devotion that was both paternal and fraternal. He contributed to the welfare of his tenant and his parish with a quiet consistency that attracted no notice because he did not seek any. He was, in the truest sense of the word, a good man, not a perfect one, not a flawless one, but a man who had looked at his own faults with an honest eye and had striven, with whatever degree of success, to be better. She learned, too, that love was not the simple thing she had once imagined it to be. It was not the sudden flash of admiration that she had felt for Wickham's easy charm, nor the steady warmth that Jane felt for Bingley's open goodness. It was something more complex, a daily choice, a continual act of seeing and being seen, of forgiving and being forgiven, of recognizing the imperfections in another person and choosing not to overlook them, but to love the person who bore them. And she learned that the greatest error a person could make was not the error of misjudgment, for that, in the nature of things, was inevitable, but the error of certainty, the conviction that one's own perception was complete and infallible, that the picture one had constructed of another person was the whole and unalterable truth. She had made this error with Mr. Darcy, and the cost of it had been months of unnecessary pain and a near miss of the love that was to be the great happiness of her life. She thought of this sometimes in the quiet evenings at Pemberley, when the fire was low and the house was still, and Mr. Darcy was reading beside her, his brow slightly furrowed in concentration, his hand resting, as it always did, close to hers. She thought of the young woman she had been at the Meryton assembly, so sure of herself, so quick to judge, so blind to the possibility that she might be wrong. She thought of the long, winding path that had led from that evening to this one. The misunderstandings and the revelations, the pride and the prejudice, the letter that had opened her eyes, and the proposal that had broken her heart, and the second proposal that had mended it. And she was grateful, not for the pain which she would not have chosen, but for the understanding that the pain had made possible. She had learned to see, and in learning to see, she had learned to love, and in learning to love, she had found the thing that she had not known she was looking for. A home that was not a place, but a person. A companion whose presence made the world, with all its difficulties and disappointments, a place of enduring wonder. The fire burned low. The night deepened. Mr. Darcy looked up from his book and met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw, as she had seen 1,000 times before, and would see 1,000 times again, the reflection of everything that they had been to each other, the struggle and the discovery, the error and the grace, the long journey from misunderstanding to love. He smiled, she smiled, and the quiet house held them both in its gentle embrace as the stars turned slowly overhead and the dark hills of Derbyshire slept beneath the moon, and the world, in all its beauty and its brevity, was still. The morning after Elizabeth's engagement to Mr. Darcy dawned gray and soft over Longbourn, the kind of morning that seems to exist in a state of gentle indecision, neither fully committed to rain nor willing to surrender to sunshine. A low mist clung to the fields, blurring the boundary between earth and sky, and the birds sang with a something had changed, and were not yet sure whether to celebrate or to mourn the passing of the old order. Elizabeth woke early, as was her habit, and for a long moment lay still in her bed, staring at the ceiling with the fixed attention of someone trying to determine whether a remembered event actually occurred or was merely dreamed. The ring on her finger, a simple band of gold that Darcy had placed there the evening before with hands that trembled almost as much as her own, was real. The weight of it was real, and the feeling that occupied her chest, that strange, expansive sensation that was part joy and part terror and part something for which she had no name, was real beyond any possibility of doubt. She got up and went to the window. The garden was misty and still, the flowers heavy with dew, the path leading down to the gate, a pale ribbon disappearing into the haze. She had walked that path 1,000 times, in every season and every mood, and it had always been the same path, familiar, unremarkable, a route to somewhere else. But this morning it looked different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The world was the same. She was the one who had been altered, transformed, turned inside out, and reassembled in a new configuration that she did not yet fully understand. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, and she was struck, as she had been struck several times in recent days, by the sheer improbability of it. She had met Mr. Darcy at a ball, and she had disliked him instantly, and that dislike had been so thorough and so satisfying that she had nurtured it like a delicate plant, watering it with every new piece of evidence that seemed to confirm it, and pruning away anything that threatened to contradict it. She had built a tower of judgment on a foundation of first impressions, and the tower had stood for months, solid and imposing, until a single letter had revealed the foundation to be made of sand. But But the letter alone had not been enough. Letters could be lies. After all, clever fabrications designed to deceive. What had truly changed her was not the letter itself, but the process of reflection that the letter had set in motion. The slow, painful, unwilling examination of her own motives and assumptions that had continued through the long weeks of the spring and summer, like a river wearing away at stone. She had been forced to confront the possibility that she was not the person she had always believed herself to be, not the clear-eyed judge of character, not the superior observer who could see through pretense and falsehood where others were deceived, but simply a woman who had made a mistake, and then, out of pride, had refused to correct it. This confrontation with her own fallibility had been the most difficult experience of her life. More difficult than Mr. Collins's proposal, more difficult than Lydia's elopement, more difficult even than Mr. Darcy's first proposal, which had at least had the advantage of giving her a clear target for her anger. The process of admitting that she had been wrong, not merely mistaken, but wrong in a way that reflected badly on her character, on her judgment, on her very capacity for fairness, had required a kind of moral courage that she had not known she possessed. And she was not entirely sure, even now, that she possessed it fully. The admission had been wrung from her, not freely offered, and she suspected that there were still corners of her pride that had not been fully illuminated by the light of self-examination. These were the thoughts that occupied her as she dressed and went downstairs to breakfast, and they were still with her when she entered the breakfast room and found Jane already seated at the table, her face radiant with a happiness that needed no words to express it. The two sisters looked at each other, and something passed between them that was deeper than any spoken communication. A recognition, perhaps, of the fact that they were both about to embark upon the great adventure of married life, and that whatever lay ahead, they would face it with the support of the person who knew them best. I could not sleep, Jane said, with a softness that was characteristic of her. I kept thinking about all the mornings that are ahead of us, and I found that I could not stop smiling. Elizabeth sat down beside her sister and poured herself a cup of tea. I slept very well, which surprises me. I expected to lie awake all night, rehearsing everything that has happened and wondering whether I have done the right thing. And have you done the right thing? Elizabeth considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I believe so, but I have learned in recent months to be cautious about my beliefs. They have a way of being wrong. Jane reached over and squeezed her hand. You are too hard on yourself. You made a mistake about Mr. Darcy. That is not a crime. It is merely human. It was more than a mistake, Jane. It was a systematic refusal to see the truth, and the refusal was motivated by pride. I did not want to be wrong about him, because being wrong would mean admitting that my judgment was flawed, and I valued my judgment more than I valued the truth. That is not merely human. It is a specific and particularly unpleasant variety of human failing. Jane listened to this with her usual patience, and then said gently, "But you did see the truth in the end. You read the letter, and you thought about it, and you changed your mind. Many people would not have done that. Many people would have read the letter and found reasons to disbelieve it, because disbelieving it would have been easier than admitting they were wrong." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. She recognized the justice of Jane's observation, and she was grateful for it, though she did not say so directly. Jane had a gift for offering comfort without minimizing the thing that needed comforting, and Elizabeth had come in recent months to appreciate this gift more than she ever had before. The breakfast proceeded in a companionable silence that was occasionally broken by the sounds of the household stirring to life. The clatter of pots from the kitchen, the thud of boots on the back stairs, the distant and indistinguishable murmur of Mrs. Bennet's voice, which had been in a state of near continuous animation since the double engagement had been announced, and showed no signs of subsiding. Mrs. Bennet, in fact, had achieved a level of happiness that was almost alarming in its intensity. She moved through the house like a woman possessed, issuing orders, making plans, and emitting small sounds of satisfaction that were not quite laughs and not quite sighs, but something in between, a vocal expression of an emotion too large to be contained. She had already written to her sister, Mrs. Phillips, and to her brother, Mr. Gardiner, with the news, and she was in the process of composing a letter to Lady Lucas that was intended to convey the information in a manner that was modest enough to avoid the appearance of boasting, while still making absolutely clear that 2 of her daughters were to be married to men of considerably more consequence than any of the Lucas girls could reasonably expect. Mr. Bennet, by contrast, had retreated into himself with a deliberateness that Elizabeth recognized as his way of processing significant emotional events. He spent longer than usual in his library, emerged only for meals, and spoke little. When he did speak, his remarks were of the kind that could be taken either as ironic detachment or as genuine reflection, and Elizabeth, who knew him well, suspected that they were both. "I observe," he said one evening, as the family sat in the drawing room after dinner, "that we are about to lose 2 of our daughters to marriage. This will leave us with 3, which is a reduction of 40%. I am not sure that the household can sustain such a loss without a corresponding reduction in expenditure, particularly in the area of ribbons. Oh, Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet exclaimed. "How can you talk of ribbons at a time like this? We are about to acquire 2 sons-in-law of great consequence, and all you can think of is economy." "I think of it," said Mr. Bennet, "because economy is one of the few subjects that remains comprehensible to me in the midst of the general upheaval. I understand ribbons. I do not pretend to understand how my second daughter, who has hitherto shown a remarkable talent for resisting the commands of others, has been persuaded to accept a man she once described as the most disagreeable creature in the world. Elizabeth, to whom this remark was clearly directed, met her father's eyes with a look that was both affectionate and unyielding. "I was wrong about him, Papa, as I have had occasion to observe before." "So you have. And I observe in my turn that being wrong has agreed with you remarkably well. You look better than I have seen you look in months." This was as close as Mr. Bennet came to expressing approval, and Elizabeth received it as such, with a warmth that she did not try to conceal. The days leading up to the weddings were filled with the particular kind of chaos that attends the preparation for any major family event. Dresses were fitted and refitted. Linens were counted. Guest lists were compiled, debated, revised, and re-revised. Mrs. Bennet, who had never been accused of an excess of organizational skill, somehow managed to oversee the preparations with a competence that surprised everyone, including herself, and that she attributed with characteristic immodesty to the stimulating effect of happiness upon the mental faculties. Elizabeth found herself during this period spending a great deal of time in reflection. The engagement had given her a measure of peace. The restless anxiety that had plagued her since Lydia's elopement had finally begun to ease, but it had also opened a door to a new kind of uncertainty. She was going to marry Mr. Darcy. She was going to leave Longbourn, the only home she had ever known, and go to live at Pemberley, a place she had visited only once and knew primarily through the reports of others and through the descriptions in Mr. Darcy's letters, which were numerous and detailed and revealed in their careful attention to the landscape and the house and the gardens, a desire to prepare her for what she would find there that was both touching and, in its intensity, slightly overwhelming. She thought about what it would mean to be the mistress of Pemberley. The house was large, far larger than Longbourn, and the estate was extensive, and the responsibilities that came with it were of a kind that she had never had occasion to consider. She would be responsible not only for the management of the household, but for the welfare of the tenants and the villagers who depended upon the estate for their livelihoods. This was a duty of considerable magnitude, and Elizabeth was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she was not entirely certain she was equal to it. She spoke of this concern to Jane one evening as they sat together in Jane's room, the window open to the mild autumn air, the last light of the sunset fading from the sky in bands of amber and rose. "I am not afraid of hard work," Elizabeth said, "and I am not afraid of learning new things, but I am afraid of failing at something that matters to other people, not just to myself. At Longbourn, my failures are private. They affect no one but me. At Pemberley, every mistake I make will have consequences for people who have a right to expect better." Jane considered this. "You are thinking too far ahead," she said, in her gentle way. "No one expects you to be perfect from the first day. Mr. Darcy least of all. He knows, better than anyone, that you are not perfect, and he loves you anyway. That is rather the point of love, I think." Elizabeth smiled. "You make it sound very simple." "It is simple. It is not easy, but it is simple. There is a difference." Elizabeth thought about this distinction, and she found that she agreed with it. Love, in her experience, was simple in its essence, a recognition, a connection, a choice, but it was not easy in its practice, because the practice of love required the continual surrender of the self, the continual willingness to be wrong, to be humble, to put another person's needs before one's own. This was simple to understand and endlessly difficult to do. And the difficulty did not diminish with practice, but merely changed shape, like a puzzle that reveals a new configuration every time it is solved. The wedding of Jane and Mr. Bingley took place on a morning of extraordinary beauty, one of those crystalline autumn days when the air is so clear and so sharp that the world seems to have been freshly created, and every leaf and stone and blade of grass gleams with a kind of primal radiance. The church was full. The Lucases were there in their best clothes. Mrs. Lucas, wearing an expression of complicated goodwill that suggested she was both genuinely happy for Jane and quietly calculating the relative social advantages of the match. Sir William Lucas, who had been knighted so long ago that he had almost ceased to mention it, beamed at everyone with the indiscriminate warmth of a man who genuinely liked people and saw no reason to be selective about it. Mr. Collins was there too, having obtained permission from Lady Catherine to attend, and he sat in his pew with the rigid posture of a soldier at attention, occasionally casting glances toward the altar that combined reverence with a kind of proprietary pride, as though the ceremony were in some sense a production of his own devising. Jane, walking up the aisle on her father's arm, was beautiful in a way that silenced the congregation, not because her beauty was spectacular. It was not. But because it was so perfectly matched to the occasion, so completely in harmony with the simplicity and the sincerity of the moment, that it seemed to express something that words could not. She wore a dress of pale blue that Mrs. Bennet had selected after considerable deliberation, and no fewer than 3 consultations with the dressmaker, and she carried a small bouquet of white roses that trembled slightly in her hands, the only sign of the emotion that lay beneath her serene exterior. Bingley, standing at the altar, watched her approach with an expression of such open adoration that even Mrs. Bennet, who was not given to noticing the finer nuances of other people's emotions, was struck by it. He looked, in that moment, like a man who has just been told that everything he has ever wanted is not only possible, but real, and who cannot quite believe his good fortune. The ceremony was brief and dignified, and when it was over, the congregation emerged from the church into the bright autumn morning, blinking in the sunlight like creatures emerging from a cave, and the bells began to ring, and the sound of them rolled across the fields and echoed off the hills, and was carried on the wind to the farthest corners of the parish, where it was heard by people who had not been invited to the wedding, and who received the news of it with the particular mixture of pleasure and envy that characterizes the response of those who are excluded from celebrations to which they feel they ought to have been included. Elizabeth, standing among the guests, watched her sister walk back down the aisle on Bingley's arm, and she felt a surge of happiness so intense that it was almost indistinguishable from sadness. Jane was married. Jane, who had deserved happiness more than anyone Elizabeth knew, had found it, and the finding of it was beautiful and right and complete. But there was something final about it too, a sense that an era had ended, that the world they had grown up in, the world of Longbourn and its routines and its small domestic dramas, was passing away, and that what lay ahead would be different, not worse, difference, however much it might be welcomed, would also involve a loss that could not be fully articulated. She felt a hand on her arm and turned to find Mr. Darcy beside her. He was looking at her with that expression that she had come to know so well, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite a frown, but something in between, a look of quiet attention that made her feel, as it always did, that she was the most important person in the world, and that he was committing every detail of her face and her posture and her expression to memory, like a man storing up provisions for a long journey. "Oh, she looks happy," he said. "Oh, she is happy. You will be happy too." It was not a question, but Elizabeth heard in it a trace of uncertainty, a need for reassurance that she found both surprising and touching. This man, who had 10,000 a year and Pemberley, and the confidence that came with a lifetime of privilege, was not sure that he could make her happy. The realization filled her with a tenderness that she had not expected to feel. "I know," she said, and she put her hand over his on her arm, and the touch was answer enough. Elizabeth's own wedding took place a fortnight later in the same church, on a morning that was less spectacular than Jane's, but in its own way more intimate. The sky was overcast, the air was soft, and there was a sense of enclosure, as though the world had drawn in closer to create a private space for the ceremony. The congregation was smaller. Mr. Darcy had requested this, and Elizabeth had agreed, understanding without being told that the scale of the event mattered to him in a way that it did not matter to Bingley, and that his comfort in this instance was more important than Mrs. Bennet's desire for a grand spectacle. Mrs. Bennet had not been pleased by this restriction, and she had said so at length and with considerable feeling. But she had been overruled by Mr. Bennet, who observed that since Mr. Darcy was to be a son-in-law, and would shortly be in a position to make Mrs. Bennet's life either very comfortable or very uncomfortable, depending on the degree of goodwill he felt toward her. It might be advisable to humor him in this small matter. Mrs. Bennet, who was capable of grasping a practical argument when it was presented to her with sufficient bluntness, subsided, though she continued to mutter about the injustice of it for several days afterward. Elizabeth wore a dress of ivory silk that had been made for her by the same dressmaker who had made Jane's dress, and she carried a bouquet of garden flowers, roses and lavender, and a sprig of rosemary for remembrance that had been gathered from the Longbourn garden that morning by Jane, who had risen early for the purpose, and who had selected each bloom with the careful attention to detail that she brought to everything she did. Mr. Darcy, waiting at the altar, stood very still. He was, Elizabeth noticed as she walked toward him, even more handsome than usual, though she could not have said what had changed. It was something in the way he held himself, a straightness of the spine, a lift of the chin, a quality of alertness, as though he were bracing himself for an impact that he both anticipated and welcomed. His eyes, as they met hers, were bright with an emotion that he made no effort to conceal, and in them she saw reflected not only his love for her, but his vulnerability, his awareness that he was placing the most essential part of himself in her hands, and that the placing of it was an act of trust that could not be taken back. The ceremony proceeded. The words were spoken. The vows were made solemn promises, spoken in quiet voices that carried within them the weight of a lifetime of intention. And when it was done, and the ring was on her finger, and the minister declared them husband and wife, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her, a tectonic movement of the soul, as though a plate that had been stationary for years had suddenly begun to move, carrying her toward a new landscape that she could not yet see, but that she knew with an absolute absolute certainty, was where she was meant to be. They left the church together, and the bells rang, and the few guests who had been invited, Jane and Bingley, Mr. Bennet, the gardeners, Colonel Fitzwilliam, Georgiana Darcy, who had come from Pemberley for the occasion, and who looked at Elizabeth with an expression of shy hope that was almost painful in its intensity, gathered around them with congratulations and good wishes. Mrs. Bennet wept, which was expected. Mr. Bennet shook Mr. Darcy's hand with a firmness that surprised everyone, including Mr. Darcy. And then they were in the carriage, and Longbourn was receding behind them, and Elizabeth was watching the familiar fields and hedgerows pass by with an attention that was almost feverish, as though she were trying to memorize them, to fix them in her mind so completely that she could recall them later, when she was far away and in a different life. Mr. Darcy sat beside her, saying nothing. He understood, without being told, that she needed silence, and he gave it to her freely, watching her face as she watched the landscape, and seeing in her expression the complicated mixture of emotions that he had expected, and that he knew he could not ease. She was leaving home. She was leaving everything she had known, and she was doing it for him. The weight of this knowledge settled on his shoulders like a mantle, and he bore it in silence, and he resolved in that moment to be worthy of the sacrifice she was making. The journey to Pemberley took 2 days. They stopped overnight at an inn in a small town that neither of them had visited before, and they dined together in a private parlor, and the conversation, which had been desultory during the first day's travel, deepened as the evening progressed. They spoke of many things, of their families, of their childhoods, of the books they had read, and the places they had been, and the people who had shaped them. Elizabeth spoke of her father and her love for his irony, and her fear that she had inherited too much of it. Mr. Darcy spoke of his parents, his father, whom he had revered his mother, who had died when he was young and whose memory he cherished with a tenderness that he rarely allowed to show. They spoke, too, of the past year, of the Meriton Assembly, and the first proposal, and the letter, and the long months of silence that had followed. It was a difficult conversation because it required both of them to revisit moments that were painful to remember. But they had agreed, without formally agreeing, that honesty between them was not optional but essential. And so they pressed through the discomfort and emerged on the other side with an understanding of each other that was deeper and more nuanced than anything they had possessed before. "I was wrong about you," Elizabeth said at one point, returning to a theme that she knew she had visited before, but that she felt could not be visited too often. "I was wrong, and I was cruel, and I am sorry." "You were not cruel," Mr. Darcy said. "You were honest, and your honesty, however painful it was to receive, was the thing that forced me to examine myself. I had been told all my life that I was right by my position, by my wealth, by the people around me who had every reason to flatter me. No one had ever told me that I was wrong, not in the way that you told me. And I needed to be told. Even so," Elizabeth said, "I should have been more charitable. I should have considered that there might be another side to the story before I condemned you. You did consider it. You considered it, and you rejected it because the evidence seemed to support your conclusion. The error was not in your reasoning, but in the evidence itself, which was false. Wickham lied to you, Elizabeth. He lied with skill and with charm, and you believed him because he was believable. Anyone would have believed him." Elizabeth looked at him across the table in the flickering light of the candles, and she saw, with a clarity that was almost painful, the cost of his generosity. He was not merely excusing her behavior. He was absorbing it, taking it into himself, and transforming it through an act of will that she could only marvel at, into something that reflected not her failure, but his own growth. He was not the man she had first judged him to be. He was something far more complex and far more remarkable than that man had ever been. They arrived at Pemberley on the second evening, as the sun was setting behind the hills, and the house was just beginning to emerge from the twilight like a great ship coming into harbor. Elizabeth saw it first from a distance, the long, low facade, the rows of windows glowing with amber light, the park stretching out around it in rolling expanses of green and gold, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. It was beautiful, not in the showy, ostentatious way that some great houses were beautiful, with their columns and their pediments and their aggressive symmetry, but in a quieter, more organic way, as though the house had grown out of the landscape rather than been imposed upon it. The stone was warm-toned, the proportions were graceful, and the setting, the river, the woods, the hills, was so perfectly suited to the building that it seemed impossible to imagine one without the other. Mr. Darcy watched her face as she looked at it, and he saw the wonder in her eyes, and he was glad. "It has been in my family for generations," he said. "My father loved it more than anything, and his father before him. I have tried to take care of it as they would have wished." "You have succeeded," Elizabeth said, and meant it. The carriage drew up before the entrance, and the door was opened by a footman in the Darcy livery, and Elizabeth stepped out onto the gravel drive and stood for a moment, looking up at the house that was to be her home. The front door opened, and light spilled out, and a line of servants stood within, their faces arranged in expressions of respectful welcome that were nonetheless animated by a genuine curiosity about the woman who was to be their new mistress. Elizabeth felt the weight of their regard and understood, with a sudden and acute awareness, that she was not merely entering a house, but assuming a role. a role that carried with it responsibilities and expectations that she could not yet fully comprehend, but that she would have to learn, and learn quickly, if she was to discharge them with the competence they deserved. As she took a breath, she straightened her spine, and she walked through the door. The entrance hall was large and well proportioned, with a marble floor and a staircase that curved upward into the upper reaches of the house, with an elegance that spoke of taste and of generations of accumulated refinement. But what struck Elizabeth most forcefully was not the grandeur of the space, but its warmth. A fire burned in a great fireplace to one side, casting a ruddy glow across the stone. Flowers stood in vases on several tables, fresh flowers, recently arranged, their scent mixing with the smell of wood smoke and beeswax to create an atmosphere that was both grand and domestic, both impressive and inviting. Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper, came forward to welcome her. She was a woman of middle years, with a composed and dignified manner that suggested long experience of great houses and great families, and her welcome was expressed in terms that were perfectly calibrated to convey both respect and a measured approval that Elizabeth sensed was not automatically given. "We are very happy to welcome you to Pemberley, madam," Mrs. Reynolds said. And Elizabeth, who had learned to read people with some care, heard in the housekeeper's voice a genuineness that went beyond mere formality. This woman had known Mr. Darcy since he was a boy. She had watched him grow up, had served his family for decades, and her approval of his choice of wife was not a small thing. "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds," Elizabeth said. "I am